Hi everyone, Cassie here from Primrose Dawn, and today I'm going to talk about knit bands and knit binding, the differences between them, and how to sew them. Knit bands are an edge finish made with a narrow strip of fabric that's sewn to the edge, turned back, and top stitched down. And as you can see, the raw edges on the inside will be exposed. On this one, I used a lightning stitch to attach the band and then top stitch with a wider zigzag. And on this one, I used my serger to attach the band, and then I top stitched it with a wide zigzag. And now here's an example of a binding. A binding feels a bit thicker than a knit band, but it encases the seam allowances, so it has a nicer looking finish on the inside. This is also a narrow strip of fabric that's sewn to the raw edge, and then it's turned around to the outside and the edges stitched down. I used my cover stitch machine to finish this, so it looks like 2 rows of stitching from the outside, and then the cover stitch, the filler stitches on the inside. We're going to begin with sewing a knit band. So this is my sample piece. I've marked with a pen the right side and the wrong side because I want you to understand which side we're working with. And then this is my piece that will be the knit band. I've already pressed it, wrong sides together, so both sides of the band will be the right side. And we're going to begin with the right side up, and we're going to align all the raw edges. And we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam, and I have my machine set to a lightning stitch. You want to be able to use a stretch stitch here. You don't want to use a straight stitch because your stitches will break when you try to put on your pair of panties. All right, let's sew. Now you want to go ahead and press the band. You'll want to turn it outwards, and you're going to press the seam allowances towards the body. Okay, I have my band all pressed, and now you'll want to top stitch it down on the body side, not on the band side, but on the body side, and you'll want to use a stretch stitch. I have it on a zigzag about 3.5 wide and 2.5 long. You don't want your stitching to extend really past the seam allowances. They're on the inside. You'll be able to feel it with your fingers where it is. Okay, and there's our knit band. It's the right side and the wrong side, the exposed seam allowances. So now let's take a look at a knit binding. Okay, now we're going to sew the knit binding. And this might be a little bit confusing at first because you're going to sew the right side of the binding piece to the wrong side of the garment. Okay, right side of the binding piece to the wrong side of the garment. And you want to sew again with a stretch stitch. I'm using a lightning stitch here. Okay, so now you're going to press, and you'll want to press the binding piece upwards so that the seam allowances will be facing the binding piece. So I'll go do that. Okay, so I've pressed the seam allowance up towards the binding, and I've also folded down a 1/4 inch from the top. That's my seam allowance. And now we're going to fold the binding over. So we're going to encase the seam allowances, and we're also going to cover our previous line of stitching. And you can use clips or pins, or don't pin at all. It's whatever feels comfortable to you. I think since it's such a narrow binding, I might just not use pins here. But you have to use what works for you. And you'll want to sew the edge of the binding down with a stretch stitch, either the lightning stitch, a zigzag stitch, narrow zigzag stitch, cover stitch if you have a cover stitch machine. I think I'm going to use a narrow zigzag here. I'm going to use about 2.5 wide, I don't know, maybe 2.2 long. We'll see how that looks. Ooh, too far over here. You want to get as close as you can to the edge of your binding without falling off. You want to be sure that you're covering your previous line of stitching. Oops, I'm falling off a little bit here. It's because I had the camera in my way. See, that wasn't very good. If I was sewing this for real, I'd have to take that out. But this is the right side, and this is the wrong side. So all the seam allowances are encased. As you can see, it's a little bit thick. But those are the differences between knit bands and knit binding.